So in terms of an agenda, we'll start with a general overview of visual literacy, connect that into historical thinking. I'll talk to you about our online, the 2 websites that we use to construct e-learning activities, which are Europeana and Historiana. And then I'll give you some examples of activities that you might like to use or adapt to promote visual literacy and historical thinking. All right, so starting with visual literacy. Always a good place to start, of course, is what is it that we're talking about when we are discussing visual literacy. There are, of course, a lot of different definitions of this, but I like this one from Bridget and Drake. They define visual literacy as a person's ability to understand, interpret, and evaluate visual messages, and in turn, to use visual language to communicate with others. Now, today, because our focus is on using visual sources to understand history, we're of course focusing on the first part of that sort of definition of visual literacy, the interpretation, the evaluation. But also, of course, it can be really useful to include in your classes activities that ask students to then try and use some of those techniques that they see in visual sources. So visual literacy is something that we all use and we all have to some extent. This is something we use in our day-to-day lives and particularly on kind of a surface level. So every time we see an advertisement, a propaganda poster, a photograph, we generally get some, immediate ideas and understandings of what these messages are. But developing visual literacy skills are still important because they allow us and allow students to think more deeply and, importantly, more critically about visual materials that they engage with, to give them an understanding of how messages are constructed in different types of visual sources, and then how they are interpreted by different types of viewers. And of course, we can use our visual literacy to get historical knowledge, so substantive knowledge about a historical event or topic or ideology, just using the information that we can find in different types of historical sources. So it's a really valuable set of skills and it's really important in the study of history, but it's also important just in life in general. And I think this pair of photographs is a really good example of why it's important to engage critically with visual sources. Now, I don't know about you, but I often find in my classes that when I present students with photos, there's often this sort of assumption that photos capture the moment exactly as it really happened. And we know, of course, that this isn't always the case. And even before the advent of Photoshop, there were various ways in which photos could be manipulated to convey a certain message. So this was an example that I found online that I thought showed this quite well. So on the left, we see Vice President Mike Pence's preferred image, where he states that he is making the historic journey from the US Capitol. And you can see the Capitol Hill in the background. He is leading the pack down the center. It's in black and white. All of these things are giving us this sense that it is this sort of grand historical moment in time. And then if you see in the image on the right, we've got the same event, but seen from the side, with empty grandstands in the background. They give us a very empty grandstands in the back impression of this moment in time. So for these reasons, I think it's really important that we're teaching students to always question the visual sources that they're confronted with on social media, as well as when we are studying history. All right, so what are some general principles that we can use to help students analyze visual sources in order to teach history? It's really So the main questions that I think we should always focus on are what is shown in the image, so what do we see? What is the message or the purpose of this image, and how is that communicated in the image? And what can we learn from the image? So particularly in study of history, is there actual knowledge that we can gain about a particular time or people's experience of that time that will help us to... Okay, sorry. Now, these questions all, of course, seem very straightforward, but when it actually comes to breaking these down and analysing sources to try and answer these, they can be quite complicated, and that's what we want to help students with in our lessons. So a couple of general principles. The first one I would say experience is to work from the surface down to the depths. So a useful approach for the analysis of visual sources is to start with what jumps out to you. And usually this will be the main message of a source. So the things that stand out to you for different reasons. Now, it might be things like the position of things in an image, the shape of things, color, symbols, and so on, that can make these things jump out to you as the viewer. The important thing, of course, is not to stop here. So by starting with what jumps out to you, and looking in more detail at the image to see what would understand other messages of an image. So the image I have on this slide here is an image that was taken by an official German war photographer somewhere near the so somewhere near the Western Front. We are in by an official war photographer. So usually they were trying to convey some sort of a message about how the troops were going on the front. So I think a good place to start is with what you tell. So I might.
But I see that some of the people in the
I'm still here.
Perhaps it's good to pause. I think Aise, your microphone is so is it possible for you to mute it? If you have a question, we're happy to give the floor for you to mute. The background noise is Alexandra is not it's from Aise, so it's one of the participants. Perhaps it's possible for you to mute it. So it's not on our side. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you. Okay. So starting with what jumps out to you, and then looking at the details is how I think is a good way for us to look at an image. So could I ask you maybe in your in the chat to tell me for you in this image, what are the things when you look at this photo that jump out to you the most? So for example, for me, I would say that the area around the piano and the two men that are located there jump out to me the most. And I think that's because it's in the foreground, but also because the dark color of the piano contrasts quite a lot with the color in the rest of the photo, and that attracts my attention. Does anyone have other ideas of things that stand out to them in this image? Okay, so Angela says uniforms, pipes, yes, recreational activities, absolutely. And I think that is, so yes, soldiers having fun, Ravina is noting there. And I think these are the things that jump out to us in the image, and these, as I say, are usually the main message that the photographer is trying to convey. So this idea that the soldiers are having a great time on the front and it's not all doom and gloom and so on. So what do you think, if you look a little bit more deeply into the photo at some of the details, rather than just what jumps out to you when you first have a look, is there anything that you notice, say, in the background or in some of the smaller details in the image? So for me, again, for example, when I look a little bit more deeply, I see the man standing in the background. And this time he's armed, he's wearing a helmet, he seems to be looking through binoculars. So it suggests to me maybe that he is on alert. They want to show perhaps that they are still doing an important job and they are facing danger. It does. I agree with you, Angela, that it does look a bit artificial, as though they may be staged. And for me, it raises a question, absolutely, with the gentleman in the background who seems to be on guard, so to speak, if they really are potentially close to danger or close to the front. It doesn't seem perhaps realistic that they would be merrily playing the piano at the same time. So I think there's certainly the possibility that this could be Stage, yes. And I think this is a really important thing that Olga is showing us here, that as we go, we should also be asking questions and demonstrating to students how we do this and try to understand the kinds of ideas that are being conveyed in an image like this. And so I think that this is always a good approach for you as a teacher, but also for the students, to start with what jumps out and then look in more detail, because often students will stop after that first stage. And so it's really important that we encourage them to look at the details of an image and think about what messages these might be conveying, these details. So another general principle that I would suggest when working with images is to always ask students to both describe and interpret what they're seeing. And there's a few reasons that this is really important. So the first one is this helps students avoid making false assumptions. If they are forced to first tell us what they see and then what they think it means, they're not leaping straight to some sort of assumption about what's going on in the image. This also means they have to justify how they've arrived at their interpretation, which of course is really important when constructing an argument in history. And also by doing this, it helps students get an understanding of how meaning is constructed in these visual sources. So what exactly is it that you see that gave you this impression or led you to this interpretation? So this can be something that is very, very simple. I've given you an example here. So for this image, if you're asking a student to describe and interpret things that they see in the image, my example would be the women in the image here are wearing decorative dresses and hats. So I'm just describing what I'm seeing. I then interpret that to mean that they might be wealthy women. So if you'd like to take a moment now, maybe again in the chat, to see if you have a look at this image, are there other things that you could see something particular in this image and interpret that to mean something about what we're seeing? Sorry, I'll just give you a moment. Okay, so the work is very good in the life of women. I see that from Afef. And what is it in the image that you see? So what would you describe that leads you to that interpretation? Okay, so Angela notes that the men are holding umbrellas. And what do you think that shows us? What would you interpret out of the fact that the men are holding the umbrellas for the women? Okay, so Olga suggests maybe this is lazy men and this suggests inequality. I think that's a valid interpretation here. Okay, and Angela suggests that maybe men are what they seem and women are perhaps not. Okay, and Afef suggests that maybe this means that women have many responsibilities. So I think this is the important thing, but what I would really recommend is making sure that that these things always go in a pair. So what is it that you literally see in the picture? So the men holding umbrellas, for example, and then what do you interpret that to mean? So perhaps it means there is inequality between the men and the women. Maybe the men are being lazy in this instance, but there could be another explanation for that. Perhaps, yes, as Fatma suggests, the men were being gentlemen in this instance and helping the women as they did their work. So this is exactly what we're looking for as we go. So I always suggest making sure that students are both describing what they see and then explaining what they interpret that to mean. Another general principle I would say is considering different perspectives. So when we're working with visual sources, there are three perspectives in particular that we need to focus on or consider in our work. And those are the perspective of the creator, so the artist or the photographer, whoever made the source, the contemporary viewer's perspective, so the viewer who would have seen this source at the time, or perhaps we could better express as a viewer who might have seen this source at the time, and then the present day viewer's perspective, so which is probably your own perspective. And usually these are quite different perspectives, but they are equally valid and important interpretations, and we should consider them. Now, of course, we can't know for sure what the creator thought, or perhaps how someone at the time would have interpreted a particular image, but we can use our historical contextual knowledge to make a good guess or attempt historical perspective taking to think about how this may have been received. So this particular source I've got for you here, it's a satirical image. And it comes from 1862. And it is shortly after Darwin has released his theory of evolution, which at the time, of course, was rather radical. And so we can see that the creator here is making fun of that theory of evolution by suggesting that perhaps a bulldog evolved into a butler. And they've done that with this sort of rather ridiculous set of images that shows the butler sort of coming out of his previous dog form. Now, we can assume that perhaps a contemporary viewer who also perhaps considered these views as being rather radical might have thought this was funny, but of course it's a rather incorrect or rather inaccurate portrayal of the theory. Now, as a present day viewer, coming from a time when Darwin's theories are widely accepted in the scientific community, we have a very different perspective on someone making fun of his theory in this way. So I think this is a good example of exactly how perspectives change. And Anasaur raises a really great point that perspectives do change from person to person. So even though we do speak about a contemporary viewer's perspective or a present day viewer's perspective, perhaps Stephen's perspective and mine would actually be quite different. So we do have to take that into account as well. The last sort of general principle, and this applies particularly to history, that I'd like to speak about is using contextual knowledge and captions. So, of course, contextual knowledge is really, really important in order for us to gain historical understanding from an image. So students need to consider, for example, where the image came from, who created it, when it was created, what was going on at the time that it was created, all of these kinds of things. Also, are there particular symbols that are in the image that you would need contextual knowledge to understand? Now, most of this would hopefully be conveyed by your teaching in the classroom. So generally speaking, we would use a visual source to teach a topic that we've already introduced to students. And of course, giving students contextual knowledge about a period will also help them to consider these perspectives we talked about earlier, the creator's perspective or the contemporary viewer, by giving them an idea about how people at the time saw certain issues or certain events. But I would say that how you use contextual knowledge will depend a little bit on your learning goals. The other, of course, important source of contextual knowledge for an image is a caption that goes with it. Now, it might be useful for you to provide this to the students straight away, but it might also be useful in some cases to withhold the caption until a little bit later in the learning process. And there would be a couple of reasons you might want to do that. So one reason is if you provide students with a really detailed caption that starts to sort of analyze the image, that will usually guide their own interpretation. So if you'd like to give them a chance first to analyze it for themselves and think about it in a really open way, you can ask them to analyze an image first and then give them the contextual information afterwards that might help them look for particular details they didn't notice by themselves. We should also be cautious in always checking the captions because sometimes they contain misleading information. But the other use I can see in withholding contextual information in a caption is also to show students how important contextual information is to making sense of an image. So I've chosen this image for this reason because I think it's a good example of that. So this image is from the 1968 Olympics, a very famous moment that we probably are all quite familiar with, but our students might not necessarily be. Now, some amount of contextual knowledge will be important from the start because you would need to have an understanding of the symbolism of the Black Power movement and the raised fist, for example. But I think this image also gives us an interesting opportunity to think about the importance of context if we consider the man on the left here. So here's a white man. He's in this image standing looking rather passive and just sort of staring straight ahead while this protest, very powerful protest, is occurring behind him. So as a student, if you were looking at this image, how do you think you might interpret that man's stance, that one on the left there? Sorry, I'll just give everyone a minute to type in their ideas. Indifference, suggests Ravina. I think that's absolutely a possibility, because he does look like he is either perhaps unaware or not really caring what is going on behind him. So sorry, just to repeat the question. I'm looking at the man on the left here, the white man on the left in this image, and asking how you think students might interpret his sort of rather passive stance. So we've got the two men behind him raising their fists in protest, and he's just looking rather straight ahead of himself. Okay, so we have, oh, sorry, I'm just trying to make my way through all of these comments. Yeah, so maybe Angela suggests he might not feel like he's part of the movement. That, as Olga suggests, maybe, you know, because he's not a winner, he is not sort of raising his fist in a sense of sort of victory. Are there other ideas? Janina suggests perhaps no racism. I mean, I think this idea that perhaps he is indifferent to what's going on behind him, or perhaps at a stretch he doesn't want to be associated with this movement, would be something, a logical interpretation of this image. Actually, what we're seeing here, this is, I'm a little bit biased, an Australian athlete, and he was quite involved in preparing for this moment. He knew it was going to happen. He was wearing a pin from the Olympic Project for Human Rights, which was supporting racial equality. And apparently it was his idea for the two men to share, because they only had one pair of gloves, to share the pair of gloves to make it a more powerful stance. And he didn't feel that it was appropriate for him to raise his fist in a symbol of the movement. So I think this is a good example of where the context of a story actually tells you things that you don't necessarily see in the image. All right, I'm aware that there's a lot to get through, so I'm going to jump into historical thinking, but before I do, we might just take a little moment if there are any questions at this point about those general principles for teaching visual literacy skills. Just wait another minute and then we'll keep moving. I think Angela raises a really good point about trying to make sure that the teacher doesn't influence too much how the students read an image. And that was kind of the same idea I was conveying about providing those captions as well. I think it can be useful in some cases to try and let students engage quite independently with a source first, and then perhaps provide them with some more guidance. Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I might keep going. There will be other chances, so please type your questions into the chat and we will pause again in a little while, but I will keep moving because there's a lot of things I want us to get through. All right, so historical thinking. I'm not sure how familiar or not you already are with some different models of historical thinking. There are quite a few of them from different theorists. I like this one that I've got on the screen here. It comes from some Dutch researchers, Van Drie and Van Boxtel, and they developed this one in 2016. and it gives us lots of different sort of aspects that are involved in historical thinking. And I just wanted to take a moment to demonstrate a little bit how visual literacy can help students in developing these different ways of thinking. So we've already discussed how it can be useful for using historical sources, which you can see sort of on the bottom right-hand side of the hexagon, and also for historical contextualization, which you can see up on the top left-hand side of the hexagon. Visual sources also can give students, particularly if you have several together, opportunities to engage with continuity and change, or look at similarities and differences, which are historical reasoning skills in the middle there. They can also develop all of these areas on the outer ring. I think interest in history is a good one because, of course, history is usually a very text-heavy subject, and for some students that's a real turn-off. So I think figuring out ways to use visual literacy really powerfully in our classrooms can help students that prefer to learn in different ways, or perhaps struggle with, dealing with a lot of text, because there's a lot of rich sort of knowledge and thinking that can come out of working with visual sources as well. And then, of course, as I mentioned, developing historical knowledge, thinking about how messages are conveyed, and constructing arguments about a particular source. So in a moment, I'm going to take you through some examples of some learning activities that can help you to develop these skills for students. But first, before I do that, I want to take you through some of the resources online that I used in order to create these activities. So I've created these activities online, but hopefully if you're not in a position to use online learning at this point, they are also adaptable to be used in sort of an analog setting as well. So the two websites that I used were Historiana, which is Euroclio's own website, and Europeana. And I'm going to start with Europeana because, of course, the first question is, well, if I am going to try and use visual sources in my classroom, where do I find them? And Europeana is perhaps one answer to this. So Europeana Collections they work with thousands of museums, archives, libraries, galleries, and so on all around Europe. And they collect all of their digitized collections in one place where you can search for them all here. And as you might be able to see, and I think Alexandra will also share the link in the website, it's europeana.eu. They've got close to 60 million resources online now. So this is a huge repository of sources. Now, not all of those are visual sources, but quite a lot of them are. And you can see they've also got some curated exhibitions online as well that you can work through. So these are absolutely, this is a really great resource that gives us a huge amount of material to work with. Now, what we have done is tried to, with our website Historiana, collect some of the best bits of what is out there on Europeana, and we're still in the process of doing this, and communicate it to you in a way that is useful for history teachers. So this is our Historiana website, and Alexandra, thank you. I've seen you've just shared the link for that one too, which you can sign up for free. So everything on the website is free for everyone to use. If you sign up for your own login, you then get a My Historiana little button on the page, and you can use that account to save your favorite activities, your favorite resources, all of that kind of thing you can save for yourself and then use them. So I'll just walk you through very quickly some of the things that are on the Historiana website, but I would recommend that you go and have a look at it yourself to see what might be useful for you. So the first thing we have is the historical content page. Now, in the historical content section, you can find historical narratives, you've got entire units of work, and you've got these source collections. And many of these come from Europeana, and they're usually collected either around a particular theme or a historical event or so on. So it's a really great resource to have a look through those. So you can look through the source collections and save the ones that you want to your My Historiana account, and that will allow you to use them later if you want to make your own online activities. So the second section that we have on Historiana is the teaching and learning section. And here you find ready-made learning activities or e-learning activities. And these are on a whole range of different topics. Usually they're connected to our units or our source collections. And they all provide directions for teachers, but also for students. The e-learning activities can actually be saved again to your My Historiana account, but you do have the possibility to edit them. So if you find an e-learning activity that you really like, but there's something that you want to change a little bit to suit your context better, then you can save it to your account and go in and edit the activity to make it more appropriate for your students. So the last thing that I want to talk about is the e-learning activity builder. So this is the tool that I use to make these examples that I'm going to show you in a moment. And the builder allows you to make your own online learning activities using a range of building blocks. So you can see the building blocks are these colorful squares here. So you have a few different ones. I will show you just how I use sort of two of them that I think are really appropriate for promoting visual literacy in the classroom. As I mentioned before, I am going to demonstrate these that are e-learning activities, but many of them could be tweaked or adapted to be more analog if you so wish. But I do think that there are some real values in having e-learning activities if it is feasible for you to do this in your classroom. So I think one major advantage is that tasks can then be set as sort of either preparation or homework. So for example, you could set a student a task or all of your students a task to prepare a really detailed visual source analysis at home. So then when they get to class, they've all already thought about the image and you can really maximize your class time with a discussion or a hands-on activity that you do all together. So that's one way that you might want to learn it. Use this kind of activity. The other thing is that because the builder is quite adaptable, you can create multiple versions of the same task and then differentiate them. So change your instructions a little bit or change the task a little bit, and that can allow you to quite easily send a particular group of students one version of the task that might extend them, and another version of the task goes to another group of students that might need a little bit more support and scaffolding. So these are just a few ways that I think the e-learning can be beneficial in your classroom, but of course it really depends on your context. The other thing I would just mention, particularly with the use of visual sources, is that when we do these things online, we are allowing students to kind of manipulate images in a way that they can't always do on paper on a printout. So there's another benefit in there. So as I mentioned, there's two tools in particular that I'm going to look at. So the first one is the analyzing tool. So up here you see the analyzing tool is this little green button here. And what the analyzing tool allows students to do is to annotate an image. So they can drag a square over an interesting part of an image and type in their own annotation. So at the moment, this only allows you to work with one image at a time. We are looking to develop things in the future that might change that. But I think this tool is really useful for getting students to do a deep reading of one particular image. And this is somewhere we could very easily ask students to do a describe and interpret task like we talked about before, to locate particular things in the image based on the inquiry question that we set. The other tool that I want to use, or I will use in the examples that I've got for you today, is the sorting tool. Sorry, it's just very bright, so hopefully you can see what it is. So in this case, you upload your choice of sources, and you would have as many as you like, and they will appear in this case as thumbnails on the picture, and then you can select a background. So I know it's maybe a little bit tricky to see here, but this shows us the different backgrounds you might select. So if I select this one, for instance, I might be asking students to arrange the sources in chronological order. If I'm using this big one that I've got on the screen, perhaps I'm asking them to put the most persuasive source in the middle and then rank the sources moving outwards. You've also got a Venn diagram here, so you can ask students to separate sources into different types or categories, and so on. And of course, these two tools could be used together. So perhaps you want students to first analyze a source or a set of sources in depth and then sort them, or do the inverse, get them to sort first and then analyze them in depth. So there's a few different ways that you might want to use these. I will pause again for questions here, and then I will walk you through the couple of examples that I have. I know we're a little bit tight on time, but hopefully we can just get to a few of them. I don't know, Alexandra, if you've collected some. If you have any more questions at this point before I walk you through my examples, please type them into the chat. Okay. So sorry, I've just been speaking to Alexandra, and I think because we are a bit short on time, we'll go through the examples first, and then we'll have a bit longer for a Q&A at the end. I also think perhaps me demonstrating the examples might clarify a few things about those resources as well. So I might show you these two examples then first. So the first task that I have chosen is an activity using this source collection, which is posters from Communist China. And what I would like students to focus on for this task would be to consider what these posters can tell us about the ideal society that the Chinese Communist Party hoped to create. So in this case, I'm actually using visual sources to gain some substantive historical knowledge about the goals of the Chinese Communist Party. So a lesson like this could be used for a unit on communist China, totalitarian regimes, communism in general, or even propaganda in general. So I think certainly an understanding of communist China and communist symbols and figures would be useful for reading a bit more extensively into these posters. But I also think that it would be possible to use an activity like this as an introduction to a unit. So to see if we could use these posters to give students an understanding of what the Communist Party in China was trying to achieve, and then use that as sort of a springboard to look in more detail at how they tried to make that happen, and so on. So the lesson I prepared starts with this. So I've provided, this is the student view. So I've already, in this case, completed my activity and I've shared it with students, and this is what they can see. So it begins with a bit of an introduction where I've given some sort of contextual knowledge about Chinese propaganda posters and how they were used. The task is set with a key question. So what can propaganda posters tell us about the type of society the Chinese Communist Party hoped to create? And then I've given the instructions. So here I've said on the next page, you find an example of one of these posters. Look at it carefully, starting with what stands out to you the most and then considering the small details. So we're going from the surface to the depths. And as you look, annotate the things that you can see in the poster, thinking about what they might suggest about the ideal communist society in China. And I've given an example down here. So each annotation, as we practiced, should describe and then interpret. So the example I've given students are perhaps the green fields, that's describing what I see in the image, suggests that agriculture was very important in their ideal society. So students at this point would then press on the next button and they'd be through to the analyze tool like we've seen before. So perhaps if you want to very quickly suggest, what are some things you might annotate in this poster? What can you see that you think might suggest something about the ideal society that the Chinese Communist Party was hoping to create? All together, okay, so can we make that sort of a describe and interpret? So we've got people standing all together, looking in the same direction, I might add. And so that suggests the ideal society was a united one? Absolutely, yeah, Ravina, that's perfect. Any other suggestions? I might just take one more. Okay, so we can see certainly there's a real presence of soldiers with the military uniform at the front. We've got someone else holding a weapon. We've got a guy that appears to be wearing sort of aviation goggles in the back. So perhaps this idea is that they want a society that fights together. There is that sort of unity for the same purpose. So these are all the kinds of ideas that I would hope students might be able to gain from this. And I think it's a really rich source because, of course, you have things that stand out to you very obviously, but a lot of details, particularly down the bottom there with the background, that students might be able to locate about sort of industrialization happening a little bit, but it doesn't seem to be a priority, all of these kinds of things. So the students could then, as I showed you before, select the part of the image they want to annotate and add in their little description and interpretation there. And then, of course, I've got a question for them that I'd like them to answer to pull together what they've discussed. So what can this poster tell us about the type of society the Chinese Communist Party hoped to create? Summarize your findings in a paragraph below. And the students can type in this box here and submit their answer, and then I'm able to log in and have a look at what the students wrote. So I think an important question with a task like this is how we could integrate it into the workflow of your classroom. So I've got a couple of suggestions, but of course you might find that something else works better in your context. But you can see that that poster was one of a collection of lots of similar posters that we have on Historiana. So you could use it, for example, by giving different groups a different poster that they analyze as preparation for the lesson. And then when they come into class, you could have them share to see if they can get perhaps a more holistic view of what the Communist Party wants by looking at the different posters. So you could ask them to present to one another. You could perhaps have a jigsaw group where you have representatives of different posters comparing and contrasting what they found. Another possible use is that actually this source collection is arranged chronologically. So it starts in the 1950s and ends in the 1970s. So you could look for continuity and change over time. Do their goals seem the same in the 1950s as they do in the 70s? And you could do that either by putting the posters in order or by perhaps, because you have a written response from the students now, placing the written responses in chronological order and seeing if, based on what the students write, there is continuity or change in the kind of messages that are being conveyed in these posters. So that's just a few ideas of how we might be able to use those in the classroom. What I've also got here is another version of the same task. It's just the introductory slide. In this case, I've kept the introduction the same and the question the same, but I've offered students a little bit more support in terms of what to look for in the image. So I've said, try to find things in the image that give you clues about jobs, so the types of jobs that were important in a society, perhaps look for clothing. The ideal place, so can we see urban or rural environments, crowded or quiet, are there animals, are there houses, etc. And what are the values that we might be able to see in the poster? So do we see peace or violence or equality or leadership, tradition, modernity, etc. So this is an example of how I could see that you might differentiate a task. So the previous task that I set was a little bit more open-ended, which would be good for students that perhaps are a little bit more advanced and ready to leap into something that requires them to think a little bit more for themselves. And then if you have students that you think might require a little bit more guidance, you could have another version of the task that gives them a little bit more guidance, such as this. I'm going to move straight along because I am aware that we're tight on time, but I would like to get through the second example if we can. So the second example of a task that I've got using this time the sorting tool, I'm using a different source collection this time. I'm using a source collection that Stephen created. It is called The Visual Front, and it is a collection of official war photography from the First World War. So it comes from the Allies, from the Central Powers and so on, and this is all the kinds of photographs that governments wanted their people to see. It's a really interesting collection that I recommend having a look at, particularly if you're teaching World War I at any point in time. So in this case, the focus of my task, as you can see here, is about how photographs were used to make the lives of World War I soldiers look appealing. So last time I was asking students to see if they could understand something about the goals of the Communist Party. So it was really sort of historical substantive knowledge. In this case, I'm asking students to think more about how messages were constructed or how propaganda was constructed to convey certain ideas to the public. So this is a little bit more of a sort of analytical evaluation type task. So I've given students a goal here. Your goal is to analyze and evaluate the strategies that were used by official war photographers to make the lives of World War I soldiers look appealing. And again, I've given just a little bit of context that I took directly from the source collection. I actually decided in this one to start with a bit of a hook question. And in this case, it was, why do you think official war photographers might have tried to make soldiers' lives look appealing? Perhaps you can chuck your ideas in the chat if you have a minute. But I thought sometimes it's good to start with a question like this Because as I said, sometimes when students see photos, they accept them as reality straight away. So if we ask a question like this at the outset, we're already asking students to sort of switch on their critical brain and think about what strategies are being used by the photographer here. So I imagine students might suggest something like recruitment could be one reason they might have tried to make their lives look appealing, to encourage more people to be positive about joining the war effort, for example. I wonder if there are some other ideas. Yes. So Angela, this is actually where the image from the piano, of the men playing the piano that we looked at earlier, it comes from this collection. So they might suggest some other reasons, like perhaps the idea was to raise morale, so to show that the war effort was going well, or to show that their loved ones were having a great time. And yes, as Einar suggests, to break the negative effect on people at home by showing that there are some positives going on. So then my question that I'm going to pose to the students here is to look at a range of photographs and think about the fact that there are two ways, or some suggested ways, that photographers made their lives look appealing. So to show that they were enjoying their life on the front, and also to show that they were important. So they were doing important work, they were achieving important things, and so on. So I'm going to give students on the next page a Venn diagram, and I've asked them to put the photographs that emphasize soldiers enjoying life in the left circle, photographs that emphasize soldiers are important in the right circle, and any photographs that show both in the middle. So students will then see a screen like this, where they've got their sources all spread out in any order. And if they click on this little plus button here, they're able to see more details about the source. So it opens for them a screen like this, where they see the image up close and some contextual information about the image that you as a teacher could edit if you wanted to. So these guys are enjoying a swim. For me, I think that's showing soldiers enjoying themselves. Doesn't seem to be showing that they're particularly important in this particular occasion. So what students would then do is to, on their Venn diagram, sort those photographs depending on where they think they fit. And this is an example of perhaps where the students might like to put those images. I think this is a useful way of helping students identify patterns. So for example, they can see that we, of course, in this circle, have a lot more images that are focusing on the important work that soldiers are doing than we do on images that only show them enjoying themselves. So they can see some trends in the ways that, that strategies are being used. I know we've only got 1 minute left, so I'll just whip through the end. I've then asked students to describe the ways that photographers achieved that in those photos before, so we're getting a written response. And then to think about how successful the photographs were at making the lives of soldiers look appealing. This time I've used the sorting tool again, except I've asked students to rank the images from those they think are most successful at conveying this message that soldiers' lives could be appealing, and those that they think were the least successful. So you can see here, I've asked them to put the one they think is most successful in the middle and then spread them outwards. And of course, finishing with a question where they have to justify their choice. So those are just a few suggestions. I have here a slide that I'll let you read through for yourselves with some other general ideas of how I think you might be able to use an analyze type activity to develop visual literacy and historical thinking, and a sorting type activity in order to do that. And I will hand over to Alexandra with that. I'm sorry, it went a bit long.
To all the participants, don't worry. Even though we went quite quickly over the examples, this presentation will be shared with you. So you will have time to go through and check the various examples. But of course, we also very much invite you to check the website where you can
Sorry, I can't hear you, Alexandra.
So please go after this session and check.
Yes, that's much better.
Use it for your teaching. Now, I would like to highlight some questions. We didn't have many questions because I think the presentation was also very clear and very explicit, so that's excellent. And we had some questions. So the first question is it better for you showing images before or after presenting the topic?
I think it really depends on what you're trying to achieve by showing the images. So in some cases, like I suggested with the Chinese example, you could show it before to get students interested, and also, in that case, to have students have an idea of what sparked the Communist Revolution in China, why it happened, what they were trying to achieve. So in some cases, it might be a useful way to sort of hook students into a topic or get some ideas flowing about it. But in other cases, it's really important that they do have that contextual knowledge in order to really understand what they're looking at, in which case it's better to teach a little bit of that context first and then analyze an image sort of using that knowledge that you've developed. That's a big question, and having never taught Hannibal before, I don't know that I have an answer. Do you have a suggestion?
Yeah, I think it really depends on your aims. So I was just looking on Europeana in the meantime to see what there was on Hannibal. So, and actually there is like quite a good source. So here you can find like a tapestry. And I mean, that immediately raised like a lot of questions, such as like, okay, why would people pay a lot of money, because these tapestries were quite expensive in the late 16th century. Like, what was still the significance of Hannibal at that time? But also to analyze sort of how was he portrayed. Because you can do a visual analysis activity with that. So Hannibal is presented like in the center, really very heroic. So that gives you an idea already on the order, the person who ordered that tapestry. It would be very interesting to see also in what context it's there. So I mean, there are so many different things that you can do. I think this was a good case to have a look and see if visual sources are also there. And in this case, I think we found a useful source, but that was just in the limited time that we had, because I saw the question coming by and I thought, okay, let's have a look. Yeah. So I think for visual, the use of the Analyze tool is very good on representations. How are people being portrayed? And that's also why we have several collections on that, on Historiana, for example, on Napoleon, how is he being portrayed, but also royalty, how do you portray power? Okay, so I think especially when it's about artist impressions, there's a lot that you can do. And then also to ask a question, for example, if you would like to present him in a different way, like what would you change? So you can also annotate the changes. In this case, if you had a less positive attitude towards Hannibal, what would you change? So I think that's also a general activity that you could apply on different topics, including this one. Well, perhaps I'll also take that one. I think it's possible with primary schools as well. I mean, for sure, in terms of technology, Historiana is an open source tool, so you can register for free. So, and we don't put any like age restrictions. I do think that the complexity of the activities need to be adjusted. I mean, the technology is made to be intuitive, so I have no doubt that also young children who are in primary school can work with it, especially like the upper primary school. If you see like how quick even toddlers are working with YouTube, and I think it's actually then a good use. So I don't see limitation, but of course the complexity of the thinking will be different. So you have to very carefully choose the visuals, but especially the assignments and how much information you give. So I would say it is. The activities that we do publish on Historiana are usually meant for secondary schools, so secondary school students, so you would have to adjust it and make it more simple. What would you say?
I think I would agree with that. I think this is what, to me, is so great about having the activity builder that you can use yourself, is that you can change the instructions or the task depending on the context that you're working in. So if that's secondary or if that's primary, it's just about changing the question that you ask or the task that you ask the students to complete. I think you also maybe need to think about which sources you choose to use with primary level students in terms of things that are appropriate or easy for them to engage with. But otherwise, I think, yeah, it's really all about how you put it together and the types of questions that you're asking the students to work with.
Like, let's say in different settings, maybe as I imagine this is what the teacher wanted to ask. So
Okay.
is it through collaborative learning? Is it through um, maybe work at home? So maybe if you can elaborate about that.
So perhaps, yeah, to answer the question, so how can I use these tools in my class? We also shared the link to the previous webinar that we've organized last year. There's more information on also how to share the e-learning activities that are created with students. So once you've completed a learning activity or you copied an e-learning activity, it is in my Historiana environment. And then you can share it with students. So you can indicate what the name of the class is, which year you use it, so that you also remember which link you shared with which class. That's important for the review of the answers. And then, yeah, of course, it depends on the availability of technology. So at home, we do feel that most students are able to access a computer. The advantage of doing it like online is that you can also provide in the classroom is that you can provide support. An activity such as the analysis tool you could also do in plenary when all the students are looking at the same screen, and you could say, okay, where would you annotate, or you can invite students to make their annotations. So I do think there are alternatives.
You might also find, I don't know how many of you have access to smartboards, but you could actually get students to physically move with the sorting tool. Again, in sort of a plenary setting, whole class discussion, working together in that way. So that's one way to do it. Of course, working in groups is another. If you have a few computers but not enough for all students, you could similarly set the task as a group work assignment. Sorry, Steve.
And of course, the source collections are there. You can also copy them, the sources, when you have the information, and
print them.
Yeah, and print them.
Yeah, if you want to.
Appreciate if you will answer in the upcoming days. Would also share with you the recording of this seminar and also the presentation, so you can go through all the various examples. So thank you very much, and I see that people are typing thank you. The seminar. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Everyone have a nice afternoon, and we'll see you in the next online.
Yes. Yeah, and thank you all for joining. And Alexandra, thanks for hosting us. We're very happy with this cooperation with European Schoolnet and eTwinning. And thanks for taking the time for all the participants to join.